The topic of this talk is about data and ethics. Can you explain a little bit about what is data and ethics?
Data protection, data privacy, and data ethics. So data protection is essentially how we treat the data that we already possess, right? It's not, it doesn't address the data that we don't yet have. It doesn't address how we acquire that data. It doesn't address which data we acquire, the consent status of that data, or how we use that data. Data privacy, broadly written, are the practices we use to ensure how we can protect the person or persons to whom these data refer. And finally, data ethics, broadly, is a framework that applies to how we make decisions related to those data, right? So privacy and security are components of data ethics, but in addition, we need to understand the accuracy or veracity of data, the quality of that data, sample sizes, how it was collected, what, if any, data may be missing, et cetera. So we're really establishing a set of principles and standards to data science and analytics. So that's a very sort of broad overview. The interesting thing about data ethics is it's kind of one of those things that we all just assume exists. And we just assume that most of these things are common sense. And the thing about common sense is that it isn't always so common. And particularly when it comes to data, right? So our default setting in technology for decades has been collect everything and figure out how to use it later. And if you think about digital health, if you think about digital therapeutics, if you think about systems, you think about websites, you think about apps, you think about all those things, the default setting is, hey, we're going to take a whole bunch of information from you. And on the IT side, on the tech side, it's, storage is cheap, just hold on to it, right? Assuming that you've got all this data, right? So data ethics then will be the framework within which that we make decisions about those data, right? There are always assumptions about data, that we have enough data, that it's accurate data, it's correct. One of the ones that I'm interested in is, are we supposed to have that data in the first place, which is a huge issue, I think, when you start to unpack it. A lot of organizations have adopted what's called a privacy by design approach, which is a framework that makes decisions before we potentially have trouble, right? So for example, what do we collect and store? If I don't collect PII, assuming that I don't need it, I'm less likely to run into issues surrounding that sort of data. We as stewards of data have literal fiduciary responsibilities around data, right? We're on the hook for its protection, for its use. Data is an incredibly valuable thing. It's a dangerous thing in the wrong hands, and it's an incredibly positive, powerful thing in the right hands. So essentially data is good. It's the use cases around data that can be problematic. So one of the things you can do is you can think about specific frameworks around this, right? One, be proactive, not reactive, right? Don't remediate, anticipate. The idea is to prevent problems before they arise. Every risk management officer in every pharma company knows this, and they're always thinking about it, right? So from a compliance perspective, how does that filter through to our IT infrastructure, architecture, and approach? Two, privacy is the default, right? All personal information is to be protected. No action should be required by an individual, right? So from my perspective, do nothing is the default. And this is where opt-in, opt-out becomes a huge part of user experience. And it's something people are much more aware of now. Three, the idea that we can embed privacy into fundamental design. In other words, build it into all business processes as a foundation. Don't bolt it on, right? So we don't want to incur privacy debt the way that we can incur tech debt. We don't want to think of it as an afterthought. We want to think of it as a foundational component into the DNA of every system we build. Four is full functionality, right? Security shouldn't mean a loss of privacy, which is an issue that I think we all inherently struggle with. We feel, or we're told, that we have, in order for things to be secure, like data, we have to give things up. Privacy versus security, this sort of false dichotomy. And again, if you think of the 3-4 points before this, if you do things right, if we build them in the future, it isn't that Faustian bargain. 5, there's an end-to-end full life cycle protection, right? Most privacy issues are avoidable. The weakest link in whatever that chain is where problems are going to occur. 6, visibility and transparency, are absolutely critical, right? We talk a lot in this industry about data sharing and data democratization, when in reality, despite today's current climate, right, democracy actually requires transparency and accountability to operate. Who has access? Why? What is this data being used for? Right? These are things that we should understand up front. 7, and this seems obvious, is respect for the user, user centricity. Any information, if I can link it, can become PII or PHI, right? This is one of the things I spent a lot of time with legislators all over the country in the past couple of years. There is a huge misunderstanding, even amongst legislators who create laws like this, on how data works. There are all sorts of wrong ideas around things. The idea, for example, that HIPAA is a privacy rule, it's really not. That HIPAA means data is protected, when in reality, once data is de-identified using a legal definition, that it's safe and secure. In reality, what happens is as we combine disparate data sources, which is how we get value from data, we incur some peril, because that's when things like re-identification become possible. So we have to consider the individual, their level of personal control, their freedom of choice, and that's where legislation, GDPR, CCPA, et cetera, come in.
Here's the reality check, right? We have COVID. The COVID has completely redefined the relationships that we have with each other and with the different institutions, and through different steps of our interaction in society. So what do you think how COVID or pandemics in general can affect the privacy solutions?
We are a tech-centric society, right? Everybody's connected all the time through any number of devices. I mean, I've got my phone, 3 laptops, 2 computer screens in front of me right now. There's an iPad over here someplace. We're insane.
I got a few of them here as well.
Right, you're doing the same thing, right? We all do. So one of the things that first popped up was immediately there were 100 different tracing or tracking apps and solutions, right? You may have read about the partnership between Google and Apple, for example. I personally have been probably in a dozen conversations about COVID tracking apps. Everybody's got a phone, right? And what makes sense on the surface, at least from an epidemiological perspective, may have severe privacy repercussions if we don't think it through. What's also interesting is that, broadly speaking, Americans are not interested in COVID tracing or tracking, right? Half of US citizens are completely unwilling to use COVID tracking, even if it's from the CDC. And actually it drops lower than that for most other entities, right? If you're a cell phone carrier, if you're a tech company, if you're the federal government, by the way, it's lowest of all, like it's 31% people would trust that solution. So people just don't want to take part. It seems nuts. I look for solutions that address specific pragmatic needs, right? As opposed to just a broad, we're going to track everybody and see what happens. One case in point I'll call out is actually the recent Avenga solution regarding testing results, right? So if I need to return to work, I can go be tested at a specific lab. I can opt in. The lab will take my testing results, essentially hash them, send them up to a blockchain. That blockchain will then create a QR code, which is going to be sent to the user. When I scan that QR code, if I need entry to a certain facility, for example, it's going to show basic ID, right, which I can verify at the time that QR is viewed. But at the same time, it's also going to give me a record from an immutable right on the blockchain, right? It's going to tell me that this person had this test with these results on this date. And because it's blockchain based, I can't mess with it. If somebody asks me for a written piece of paper with my test result, I can cross off false and put true, or true and put false, right? Mutability becomes an issue. So, what I like about that is that it does harness the sort of immutable aspects of blockchain records for a use case where, if we want people to return to work and we need to know they're healthy, we also can't have alteration of test results because they want to get back into an office or get their hair cut, which isn't a problem for me, or any of these other types of things, right? So it's almost sort of a boarding pad approach. So I, as a user, know my testing results are secured and hashed and available when, where, and how I choose to share them, right? So a secure, immutable solution. This is actually being expanded now in other areas. There's this concept of what are called immunity passports. Chile, for example, is evaluating these right now. The idea is that you can prove either prior exposure and recovery, right? So in other words, I had COVID, I now have antibodies, I'm immune, right? So in other words, you're not contagious. I can prove that I'm not contagious. The Google Apple solution is essentially similar, right? In that I walk by somebody every X minutes, my phone is sending out essentially a token. So I know where I was, I know what other devices were there. And if one of those devices actually tests positive, they would send out a message and be able to know who was near me, right? So that's the idea. Are they perfect? No. Are they being engineered now to secure privacy so that you don't know it's Michael DePalma, that it's iPhone XYZ? Yes, those are good to see, but I think we're a long way off.
Just thinking about that, are there differences in ethics when it comes to data or algorithms or practices, right?
There are differences in data, algorithms, practices, right? But they're sort of inextricably linked, right? So if you begin with data and ask a few questions, right? What data do you have? How is it sourced? From whom? To whom does it refer? What rights does the data provider have to give, share, or sell you these data, right? What's the consent status of these data? What's the time frame for those consents? In other words, what practices are in place before we even have the data in our possession? Now, notice this is all before we've done anything to the data. This is merely the acquisition of that data. Algorithms are simply helping us categorize and make decisions about these data, right? So now we presume that we've gotten the data, now we're making decisions. And this is where things like bias show up. And there's a lot of conversations around this, right? Bias can be human-based or it can be data-based. So in other words, are we making the right decisions about the right data? Are we making the right decisions about the wrong data? Are we making the wrong decisions about the right data? All of those things can occur. Just as a quick aside, I love the dinner party conversation where people say things like, you know, AI should be built to, you know, human ethical or moral standards. My reply is, great, well, which human, right? Which moral standards, which ethical standards? I think of the three practices follow these general sort of questions as well, which is why data ethics is so much larger than I think people maybe give it credit for, because we choose to apply it to one area. For example, I'll apply ethics to my AI, but I've got this whole mess of data that I probably shouldn't have had in the first place, right? Or vice versa.
And that brings us to a question of ownership, right? So who owns the data?
I wish I could answer that. That's $1 billion question, right? So if you ask me legally, I'll tell you that it depends on where you are geographically, right? Or within a supply chain, right? If you ask me practically, I'll tell you that most law, at least here in the US, says things like whoever owns the media that it's stored on owns the data, which is a little bit vestigial, right? That's from the time when storage was expensive and data was cheap. And now the reverse is true. Unless of course, if you bought that data, bought from a data aggregator, in which case you have a license to use that data, based on some predetermined set of parameters, which you agree not to broach, right, for some period of time. And at the end of that time, so let's say I buy a bunch of data and I've got access to it for a year, and at the end of that year, I've got to do one of several things, right? I either give it back, which is completely meaningless, or I agree to destroy it, which also doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? Those are vestigial words and ideas when it comes to the digital world. So if the data was on paper, and there was one copy of that paper, and I burned that paper, yes, by that definition, the data has been destroyed and can't be reused, all right? However, if there are, thought experiment, right? If there are infinite copies of that paper, then the destruction of one has absolutely no impact on the usability of that data, right? Worse still, what if that, you know, if that data is about me, and I don't even know who has these papers? What if I never agreed to anyone having these papers, let alone that other parties are buying and selling these papers without my knowledge or consent? So that's where you begin to unpack how this gets a little bit crazy. In terms of value, you know, for years, we've all heard the data is the new oil trope, right? Which I think at its best can orient the listener to the idea that the data is valuable and market making the way oil is or was, but it quickly falls apart at that point, right? So with oil, which has been around for a long time, right? We have a very clear sense of provenance, where it came from, how it was acquired, where it was acquired, from whom, for what price. We know that if we have a barrel of oil, there are not infinite copies of that barrel, right? It's a physical object in the real world. And if I burn it, that means nobody else can because I'm in possession of it, right? So ownership and possession are one of the things that we talk about, which is, by the way, just a brief aside, when people talk about, you know, give me my data or possession of data, I don't know that possession really makes a damn bit of difference because you having a copy of something that 1,000 other people have is ultimately meaningless, right? But so, you know, oil, by that definition, economists would say is a rivalrous good. Data, however, is a non-rivalrous good, right? There can be infinite copies of it, and there often are, right? And the use of one of those copies does not preclude someone else from using their copy of it. And that's what makes data so compelling and valuable, right? Now, legally, if you start to look at things like GDPR, CCPA, it starts to intimate that, you know, the individual owns data, right? That they're empowered to say who can have it, for what purpose, or to elect to say, no, you can't have it or give it back or destroy it. Here in the US, however, we're on a different side of that argument, right? We regulate data, you know, in Europe, data is regulated based as a function, it's a function of the you as the individual, right? In the US, we regulate data using specific laws that depend on the type of data and the use case, right? So medical data is regulated by HIPAA and other laws, right? Employment data by ERISA, driving data, financial data, credit data, pick something, right? There are separate laws and regs that govern each of those components, right? So you have this patchwork of regs with holes in them so big you can drive a truck through them. And it's these holes that allow the data industry to thrive and sort of support these business models, right? Because we can sort of drive around them. For me, personally, I think the ownership question really comes down to a simple test to determine who should own data. And it's this, right? So if the data in question is a byproduct of a good or service that I myself pay for, right, in whole or in part, and that data can be bought, sold, or shared with a party that I don't have a relationship with, contractually or otherwise, it's my data. Okay, and let me give you an example of that. So hypothetically, I buy a brand new pair of $600 sneakers that have electronics in them that can track my activity, my steps, my heart rate, my respiratory rate, my body temperature, my geolocation, all sorts of other stuff, right? Who owns that data? Should I have to pay for a subscription to insight into my own data? Should I have to release that data? That's where things start to get a little bit weird, right? A more practical application of this is if I visit my physician, say for a physical, I get an EKG, an X-ray, maybe I fill a script. Where does that data reside? Who has access to it and for what purpose, right? If the purpose is not my treatment or care, what happens? That use case right there is several hours of conversation.
Are you suggesting that doctors and researchers shouldn't have access to your data?
But let's look at use cases, right? So I just said I visited a doctor. Now, in the US, healthcare providers are considered what are called covered entities under HIPAA, right? That means you've got access to all my information for the purposes of my treatment and care, which makes perfect sense, right? I want you to have access to this to render care, right? And that's enshrined in law, right? You also have access to that data for your own what are called healthcare operations, things like quality control, et cetera, right? Now that makes perfect sense. So assuming we agree on that, let's look at what happens next, right? So doctors, nurses, PAs, NPs, technicians, hospital administrators, they're all great. They're all very good at their jobs. But they're not good at other things, right? So for example, building massive EHR systems, okay? So that falls to other parties, tech. So we've got this whole industry of companies that build systems that collect, house, and in many cases, utilize the data that's collected and used by healthcare providers. Good so far. The thing is, those companies don't have the same right to use the data, and use is a very specific prescribed word, that the providers do, right? So the doctor's caring for you, the EHR system is not. So they're restricted in terms of their use of data. But by stripping some of that info and packaging the data up, these parties can sell that data into a larger data value chain where it's combined with and aggregated with data from other sources, and it's used to make decisions about us, right? Now, in the case of research, there are clearly defined corridors for research in most US law, right? As long as it's de-identified, which is something I mentioned earlier, or it's been approved for use by NLRB, it's okay for research. I actually want to see a system that accelerates access to data, not restricts access to data, right? The difference being is that I know who and for what purpose, right? So what would a transparent data ecosystem look like, right? Where individuals are empowered to willingly and knowingly participate in research, data collection, and use without some of the laborious machinations that are currently in play, right? So, what if researchers had a direct and direct relationship with a data subject, with a consumer? What would it look like to exchange value at that level? So, I'm saying actually we need to find a way to transparently accelerate the amount of data that's available to these people. We just need to do it a slightly different way.
Should people be paid for their data, right? If I'm a product, if I produce something, I can sell it, right? I own it, I sell it. So should we be paid for it?
It's a really, really interesting problem, and it stems from a couple different challenges, right? One, data isn't viewed the way that other property is, right? So we have real property, tangible property, real estate, intellectual property, et cetera. Data doesn't have a real definition in there. So the ownership question is difficult, right? So should people be paid? I don't know. But what I am suggesting is this, right? People have a right to know who has their data. Or they have a right to know what people have. They have a right to know what's being done with it. I am suggesting that you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, right? And that a transparent relationship between data steward and data subject should be the base case, always. I am also suggesting, and this is obvious, that data is of value. There is no refuting that, right? And there is a multi-billion or trillion-dollar industry of data. The only people who are not participating in the data economy, however, are who? Data subjects, the individuals themselves, the consumers. So what I'm saying is, what does the world look like if you change that? Remuneration, value, there's lots of different ways you can do that. When you say exchange money, people immediately go to this idea that, oh, you're selling your health information. No, first of all, you can't sell something that exists in that sort of nebulous field. The best you can hope to do would be, license it, for example. But we're not there yet. Clearly, what I think needs to happen is we need to create a value chain that includes the individuals who are the basis of that value.
What is the data's worth, right? Like in everything in the civil court, right? We talked about ACLU, right? The remedy is pay me, right? Compensation. So
Sure.
This is not criminal, right? We're not alleging any criminal activity. So we're saying there is a contract, and that contract determines the value of the enumeration, if you will, right?
Yep.
So how do you figure that out?
Yeah, a lot of people hate when I say this, but the answer is it depends, right? So it depends on the data in question, its use, and a host of other factors, right? So I'll do a quick thought experiment with you. So you see a bunch of guitars behind you, right? So I'm a musician and I collect guitars. So let's say a certain guitar is $500 brand new, okay? So ostensibly, no matter where I get that guitar, it's gonna be $500 because it's the same guitar, right? In theory, right, it should be worth less if it's used, right? Even less if it's in bad shape. So see the one behind me is in really beat up shape, right? That's because it's as old as I am. And so in theory, it loses value, right? Now, what if I say that guitar was played by Jimi Hendrix? Suddenly it's not $500 anymore. Now it's $1 million, right? What if somebody who owned it after Jimmy swapped it out and repainted it though? Now what is it, right? So things change depending on sort of circumstances, right? When you apply that to data, right, there are innumerable types of data, right? Not all data is equal. Much of it is probably noise, right? So to get to the crux of your question, I actually asked this question of a group of economists, a group of economists here in Morristown, New Jersey, called Avalon Health Economics, brilliant people. And I asked them to look into this question, right? What is data worth? Specifically health data, right? What's a personal health record worth to an individual, to a community, to an industry, which is fascinating. And one of the answers that it settled was what I just alluded to, which is its value depends on where in the supply chain you are, right? So if I'm at the beginning of the supply chain, it's pennies to dimes, right? Pennies to nickels to dimes to quarters to dollars. And by the time pharma gets it, we're paying dollars for it, right? Why? Because there's been value that's been accrued and accreted over a period of time as that data is massaged and presented different ways, right? So it depends on the data, it depends on where you are. There's no price. And so part of it needs to be understanding, where should we assess value for data?
What sort of questions do you think the industry needs to be asking about the data so that they kind of stay within the efficacy framework?
I believe that pharma companies are beginning to look at this now and think about it a little bit differently, right? You see the presence of chief data officers, chief ethics officers in large pharma now, right? So for me, I begin by looking at the data assets a company already possesses, right? So what do they have? Where is it from? What does it contain? Where is it acquired? What's the consent status of these data? What use cases is suited for? What is it authorized for, right? Once we have an understanding of sort of what we have and understand existing risks, we can then move forward to the establishment of a data ethics framework, which we can apply to both legacy data as well as future data collection use, right? There's an important point here about trust. And that's a word that gets thrown around a lot. I'll say the obvious. Pharma is not a trusted industry in the US. In fact, we're vilified, right? The amount of misinformation and mistrust out there about what we do is staggering, which always leads to a great deal of cognitive dissonance for me, right? Where people working day and night to make human lives better, safer, and we hear all kinds of crazy, baseless nonsense, right? You've all heard your share, I'm sure of it. We need to help ourselves a bit here, right? So it's a gentleman named Michael Pearson, who's the chair of social entrepreneurship at Fordham, and he said, if people don't know what you value, they will impute cynically that it's only financial. So that's sort of point one. Kristen Martin at George Washington said, when people don't trust you, right, you start to lack legitimacy until you don't have a leg to stand on to opine about what others should do. Now, if you think about those two statements through the COVID frame, for example, right, you've got people, you know, drinking Lysol and bleach because we're listening to the wrong people, right? So if you look at COVID-19, if you look at the anti-vax movement, right, you see a lot of that is real, right? Pharma needs to do itself a favor and get ahead of the trust issue. And I can wrap this up this way, right? Facebook survived its Cambridge Analytica scandal. I don't know that it goes so well if it happens in pharma or in healthcare, me personally. But for me, privacy is about the empowerment of the individual so that they can make decisions about it.
What's your thinking in terms of the technology and technology aspect of it?
It's interesting. So yeah, the horse is out of the barn, the water's under the bridge, whatever colloquialism you want to use, right? So as we've migrated, you know, I'm old enough to remember things like client server systems and on-prem systems. I remember the migration to the cloud, right, which is just a server in somebody else's room, right? And so when we used to talk about physical logical security, right? So, you know, physical access to something, that evolved, right? So now everything is everywhere all the time. And so, you know, but that led to ultimately sort of, you know, centralization, which is a real security issue, right? If all my stuff is in one place, that's where I'm going to go to get it, right? Whether I have good intent or bad intent. When they asked, I forget which bank robber it was, you know, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. Well, it makes a lot of sense, right? So that's why people are going to attack certain things. That's why, you know, hospital and health system CIOs and CISOs every day are fending off malware attacks and everything else, right? Because they're constantly being phished for access to data. Decentralized systems are an interesting wrinkle in this, in that, you know, how do we create some level of control, tokenization for an individual and still maintain access to the data when, where, and how we need it? I'm seeing there's an interesting company called HiveCell, actually, which is doing some interesting work now. One of the things that they're doing is they have a server which essentially allows you to, you know, not all the data needs to go to the cloud and then come back, right? So you think about the energy required, the time required, the compute power required to take everything at its point of origin, move it to the cloud, do some sort of, you know, work on it, and then send it back. They hypothesized that, you know, there were ways that we could break that into processes. So it's a little bit on-prem, it's a little bit cloud-based, and there are these stackable servers. So they're starting to change, you know, security. And now you're back to a physical logical security model, right? Because now I've got these devices in my hospital that allow me to control information that's not necessarily out in the cloud. Those things are interesting. I think digital identity is a fascinating area. You've got groups like Consensus, Big ID, and others that are doing interesting work in digital identity. It makes a lot of people nervous. Digital identity, generally speaking. The thing that makes data and technology strategic commodities is that, you know, they can be used for good and they can be used for evil. You know, you can weaponize these things. There's the way that other strategic commodities in human history were weaponized, right? Salt was the first strategic commodity in human history, and you can weaponize that, right? Because if you didn't have access to it, you weren't going to make it through the winter, or I could sow it in your fields and you couldn't grow crops next year. Data works the same way, right? It can be weaponized in the wrong hands. We've seen that already, but in the right hands, it does a tremendous amount of good. So I'm hopeful that the technologies that continue to come out and the thinking around the use of those technologies, more importantly, things like ethical frameworks, I think will create a better future for us. I think it's going to take a few more years for us to really get our feet under us. I would actually urge people to think a little bit about, you know, what it is you're trying to do and what the building blocks of those solutions really are. Is there a more transparent way for you to have a direct relationship with people that potentially accelerate what you're trying to do? So for me, you know, I would urge technologists, I would urge marketers, I would urge everyone to think a little bit about how can I create a transparent, accountable relationship with the people that I'm here to serve, sell to, whatever the case happens to be. I think that if you begin with that, I think that the ethics of data and privacy will flow naturally from those questions, because you'll start to ask some of those soul-searching questions and you'll get answers.